what I have to tell you is that the American people are angry at what is happening here in Washington, D.C., and they are prepared to stand up and fight back. In my view, and what I have heard from many, many people, is that they will not accept an oligarchic form of society where a handful of billionaires control our government, where the wealthiest person on earth, Mr. Musk, is running all over Washington, D.C., slashing the Social Security Administration so that our elderly people today are finding it extremely difficult to access the benefits that they paid into, where Mr. Musk and his friends are slashing the Veterans Administration so that people who put their lives on the line to defend us will not be able to get the health care that they are entitled to or get the benefits that they are owed in a timely manner. Slashing the Department of Education, slashing USAID. And why is all of this slashing taking place? It is taking place so that the wealthiest people in this country can receive over $1 trillion in tax breaks. Now, I don't care if you are a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent. There are very few people in this country who think that you slash programs that working families desperately need in order to give tax breaks to billionaires. Mr. President, I am the former chair of the U.S. Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs, and I've had the honor of meeting with veterans in my own state of Vermont, all over Vermont, but all over the country. These are the men and women who put the uniform of this country on and have been prepared to die to defend our nation and American democracy. And these veterans and Americans all over our nation will not accept an authoritarian form of society with a president who undermines our Constitution every day. Every day there's something else out there where he's undermining our Constitution and threatening the very foundations of American democracy. That is not what people fought and died to allow to happen. Mr. President, I am not a historian, but I do know that the founding fathers of this country were no dummies. They were really smart guys. And in the 1780s, they wrote a constitution and established a form of government with a separation of powers, with an executive branch, the president, a legislative branch, the Congress, and a judicial branch. These revolutionaries in the 1780s had just fought a war against the imperial rule of the King of England, who was an absolute dictator, the most powerful person on earth. And these revolutionaries here in America, forming a new government, wanted to make absolutely sure that no one person in this brand new country that they were forming would have unlimited powers. And that is why we have a separation of powers. That is why we have a judiciary, a Congress, and an executive branch. In other words, way back in the 1780s, they wrote a constitution to prevent exactly what Donald Trump is trying to do today. So let us be clear about what is going on. Donald Trump is attacking our First Amendment and is trying to intimidate the media and those who speak out against them in an absolutely unprecedented way, Mr. President. He has sued ABC, CBS, Meta, the Des Moines Register. His FCC is now threatening to investigate NPR and PBS. He has called CNN and MSNBC illegal. In other words, the leader, or the so-called leader of the free world, is afraid of freedom. He doesn't like criticism. Well, guess what? None of us like criticism, but you don't get elected to the Senate, you don't get elected to the House, you don't become a governor, you don't become a president of the United States unless you are prepared to deal with that criticism. And the response to that criticism in a democracy is not to sue the media, is not to intimidate the media, it's to respond in the way you think best. But, Mr. President, it is not just the media that Trump is going after. He is going after the constitutional responsibilities that this body, the United States Congress, has. And I will say it amazes me, it really does, how easily my Republican colleagues here in the Senate and in the House are willing to surrender their constitutional responsibilities, give it over to the president. Trump has illegally and unconstitutionally withheld funds that Congress has appropriated. You can't do that. Congress has the power of the purse. We make a decision. We argue about it here. Big debates, vote-a-ramas, the whole thing. Make that decision. That money goes out. The president does not have the right to withhold funds that Congress has appropriated. Trump has illegally and unconstitutionally decimated agencies that can only be changed or reformed by Congress. You don't like the Department of Education? You don't like USAID? Fine. Come to the Congress. Tell us what reforms you want to see. You do not have the right to unilaterally do away with these agencies. Trump has fired members of independent agencies and inspectors general that he does not have the authority to do. But, Mr. President, it is not just the media that he is trying to intimidate. It is not just the powers of Congress that he wants. Now, in an absolutely outrageous, unconstitutional, and extraordinarily dangerous way, he is going after the judiciary. His view is that if you don't like a decision that a judge renders, you get rid of that judge. You try to impeach that judge. You intimidate judges so that you get the decisions that you want. You know, I'm thinking back now as someone who is not a supporter of the Roberts Court. And I'm thinking about one of the worst Supreme Court decisions that has ever been rendered, and that is Citizens United. I'll say more about that in a moment. And I'm thinking about the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, taking away American women's right to control their own bodies. In my view, these were outrageous decisions, unpopular decisions. But it never occurred to me, because maybe I'm old-fashioned and conservative, and I believe that you live by the rule of law, to say, hey, look at the decision Roberts made. We're going to impeach him. No, we try to elect a new president who's going to appoint new Supreme Court justice. That is the system that people have fought and died to defend. But it's not just the movement toward oligarchy, which is outraging millions of Americans, Democrats and Republicans, by the way. And it's not just the movement toward authoritarianism that we are seeing. The American people, especially with Mr. Musk and 13 billionaires in the Trump administration running agency after agency, the American people are saying as loudly as they can that they will not accept a society of massive economic and wealth inequalities where the very richest people in our country are becoming much richer while working families are struggling to put food on the table. Having gone all over this country, I can tell you that the American people are sick and tired of these inequalities, and they want an economy that works for all of us, not just the 1%. You know, Mr. President, we deal with a whole lot of stuff here in the Congress, and, virtually all of it is important in one way or another. But let's do something, fairly radical today. Let's try to tell the truth, the real truth, about what is going on in our society today. Something that we don't talk about too much here in the Senate. We don't talk about it too much in the House. We don't talk about it too much in the corporate media. But the reality is that today we have two Americas, two very, very different Americas. And in one of those Americas, the wealthiest people have never, ever had it so good. In the whole history of our country, the people on top have never, ever had it so good as they have it today. Today, we have more income and wealth inequality than there has ever been in the history of America. Now, I know we don't discuss it. You don't see it much on TV. You don't hear it talked about here at all. But the American people do not believe that it is appropriate that three people, 1, 2, 3, Mr. Musk, Mr. Bezos, and Mr. Zuckerberg, three Americans own more wealth than the bottom half of American society, 170 million people. Really? Three people own more wealth than 170 million people? Anybody here think that is vaguely appropriate? And by the way, those very same three people, three richest people in America, were right there at Trump's inaugural, standing right behind the president. So you want to know what oligarchy is? I know there's some confusion out there. What is oligarchy? Well, it starts off when you have the three wealthiest people in the country standing right behind the president when he gets inaugurated. The top 1% in our country now own more wealth than the bottom 90%. CEOs make 300 times more than their average worker. And unbelievably, real inflation accounted for wages today, the average American worker, if you can believe it, despite a massive increase in worker productivity, is lower today than it was 52 years ago. And during that period, there was a $75 trillion transfer of wealth that went from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. That is the reality of the American economy today. And you know what? Maybe we might want to be talking about that. And in our America today, in that top America, that one America, the 1% are completely separate and isolated from the rest of the country. You think they get on a subway to get to work? You think they sit in a traffic jam for an hour trying to get to work? Not the case. They fly around in the jets and the helicopters that they own. They live in their mansions all over the world in their gated communities. They have nannies taking care of their babies. They don't worry about the cost of child care. And they send their kids to the best private schools and colleges. Sometimes they vacation, not in a Motel 6, not in a national park, but on the very own islands that they have. And on occasion, for the very, very richest, just for a kick, have a little bit of fun, maybe they'll spend a few $1 million flying off into space in one of their own spaceships. Sounds like fun. But it's not just income, massive income and wealth inequality that we're dealing with today. We have more concentration of ownership than ever before. While the profits on Wall Street and corporate America soar, a handful of giant corporations dominate sector after sector, whether it's agriculture, transportation, media, financial services, et cetera, et cetera. Small number of huge corporations, international corporations, dominating sector after sector. And as a result of that concentration of ownership, they are able to charge the American people outrageously high prices for the goods and services we need. Mr. President, we don't talk about it too much. Maybe we should. But there are 3 Wall Street firms, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, that combined are the major stockholders in 95% of our corporations. Got that? 3 Wall Street firms, 3, are the major stockholders in 95% of American corporations. So, Mr. President, that is one America. People on top doing phenomenally well. Not only do they have economic power, they have enormous political power. That's what's going on there. They live like kings. That's one America, but there is another America. And in that other America, 60% of our people are living paycheck to paycheck. And millions of workers from one end of this country to the other are trying to survive on starvation wages. And unlike Donald Trump, I grew up in a family that lived paycheck to paycheck, and I know the anxieties that my mom and dad have living in a rent-controlled apartment. Can we afford to buy this? Why did you buy that? And that's the story taking place all over America. What does living paycheck to paycheck mean? It means that every single day, millions of Americans worry about how they're going to pay their rent or their mortgage all over the country. Rents are skyrocketing, and people are wondering, what happens? What happens to me and my kids if rent goes up by 20%? And I can't afford it. Where do I live? Do I have to take my kid out of school? Where do I put my kid? In worst case scenario, do I live in my car? Let's be clear. There are many people who are working today who are living in the back of their cars. How do I pay for child care? Talked to a guy the other day, a police officer, spending $20,000 a year for child care. How do I buy decent food for my kids when the price of groceries is off the charts? What happens if I get sick or my kid gets sick or my mother gets sick and I got a $12,000 deductible and I can't afford to go to the doctor? How at the end of the month am I going to pay my credit card bill even though I am being charged 20 or 30% interest rates by the usurious credit card companies? People are worrying about simple things. What happens if my car breaks down and the guy at the repair shop says it's going to cost $1,000 and I don't have $1,000 in the bank? And if I don't have a car, how do I get to work? And if I don't get to work, how do I have an income? And if I don't have an income, how do I take care of my family? Those are the crises that millions of Americans are experiencing today. But it's not just working age Americans. Today in our country, half of older workers have nothing in the bank as they face retirement. And they're watching TV and they're saying, Mr. Musk firing Social Security workers and actually worrying whether Social Security will be there for them. And it's not just older workers with nothing in the bank wondering what happens when they retire. 22% of seniors are trying to survive on $15,000 a year. I dare anybody in this country, let alone somebody who's old, who needs health care, needs to keep the house warm, try to survive on $15,000 a year. And there are people here, by the way, talking about cutting Social Security. Mr. President, it is not just about income and wealth inequality. It is about a health care system which everyone in the nation understands is broken, is dysfunctional, and is outrageously expensive. I hear my Republican friends, I don't know where they are today, wanting to destroy the ACA, and my Democratic friends say, oh, we got to defend the ACA. ACA is broken. It doesn't work. In my state, the cost of health care is going up 10, 15%. In America today, you got 85 million people uninsured or underinsured. Function of the health care system today is not to do what a sane society would do, guarantee health care to all people in a cost-effective way. Something which, by the way, every other major nation on earth manages to do. The function of our health care system, as everybody knows, is to make billions of dollars in profits for the insurance companies and the drug companies. So I say to my Democratic friends, it's not good enough to defend the Affordable Care Act. It's a broken system. You got to have the guts to stand up and allow us to do what every other major nation does, guarantee health care to all people as a human right, not allow the drug companies and the insurance companies to make massive profits every year. And, Mr. President, I want to touch on an issue that gets virtually no discussion, but I think it is enormously important. And it says a hell of a lot about what's going on in our society today. In America, according to international studies, our life expectancy, how long we live as a people, is about 4 years lower than other countries. Most European countries people there live longer lives. Japan, they live even more longer lives than in Europe. So question number one, why is that happening? We spend $14,000 a year per person on health care, almost double what any other country spends, and yet people around the world are living, on average, 4 years longer than we do. But here is the really ugly fact, even worse than that. And that is that in this country, on average, if you are a working class person, you will live 7 years shorter lives than if you're in the top 1%. If you're a working class person, your life will be 7 years shorter than if you are wealthy. In other words, being poor or working class in America today amounts to a death sentence. Mr. President, it's not only a broken healthcare system. We have got to ask ourselves a simple question, and the Biden administration began a little bit of movement in this direction. And that is, why are we living in a nation where 1 out of 4 people can't even afford the prescription drugs their doctors prescribe? Why are we in some cases paying 10 times more than our neighbors in Canada or in Europe? How does that happen? And the answer, of course, has to do with the greed of the pharmaceutical industry and their power right here, all of the campaign contributions that they make, which has prevented us from negotiating prices. But it's not just health care or prescription drugs when we look at what's going on in America. In Vermont and throughout this country, we have a major housing crisis. Here we are, the richest country on earth, 800,000 people sleeping out on the streets, and 20 million people are spending more than 50% of their limited incomes on housing. Can you imagine that? You're a working person spending 50% of your income on housing. How do you have money to do anything else? And the cost of housing is soaring. Do not tell me, Mr. President, that in a nation which could spend $1 trillion on the military, a nation that can give massive tax breaks to the rich, that we cannot build the millions of units of housing that we desperately need. So, Mr. President, why is all of this happening? Why do we have a healthcare system that's broken, prescription drugs that are the most expensive in the world, a housing system, education in deep trouble? Talk to educators in Vermont, all over the country. Talked to a principal the other day from Vermont. Their starting salary at a public school, $32,000 a year. But don't worry, they can't afford to even bring people in because they can't afford the housing in the community. Why have we let education sink to the level that it has? So I think the bottom line of all this, the American people, I think, are catching on. And Mr. Musk, I must thank him because he has made it very clear. We are living in an oligarchic form of society. If anybody out there thinks that Mr. Musk is running around out of the goodness of his heart trying to make our government more efficient, you have not a clue as to what is going on. What these guys want to do is destroy virtually every federal program that impacts the well-being of working people, Social Security, Medicare, Postal Service, public education, you name it. So they can get huge tax breaks for the rich and eventually make government so inefficient that they will have the ability as large corporations to come in and privatize everything that is going on. So, Mr. President, this is a pivotal moment in American history. And I sense that the American people have had it up to here. They are prepared to fight back. They do not want a government run by billionaires who have it all, whose greed is uncontrollable. You know, we have in Vermont, and I think all over this country, serious problem with addiction, with drugs, people drinking too much alcohol, people smoking too many cigarettes. But the worst form of addiction that this country now faces is the greed of the oligarchy. You might think that if you had $10, $20 billion, it would be enough. You know, kind of enough to let your family live for the next 20 generations. But it's not. For whatever reason, whatever compulsive reason they have, these guys want more and more and more, and they are prepared to destroy Social Security, Medicare, nutrition programs for hungry people in order to get even more. That, to me, is disgusting. So, Mr. President, we are at a pivotal moment in American history. But having been all over this country, or many parts of this country, I am absolutely confident that the American people, and I'm not just talking about Democrats, who are as complicit in the problems that we have right now as are Republicans. Because we got a two-party system which is basically corrupt. You got Mr. Musk over on the Republican side saying to any Republican who dares to stand up and defy the Trump agenda, we are going to primary you. And on the Democratic side, you got AIPAC and you got other super PACs saying you stand up for working people, you're in trouble as well. We got a corrupt campaign finance system in which billionaires are able to buy elections. And that's why all over this country, people are not happy with our two-party system, the Republicans and the Democrats. So, Mr. President, this is a pivotal moment in American history. But we have had difficult moments before. And I am confident from the bottom of my heart that if we stand together and we do not allow some right-wing extremists to divide us up by the color of our skin or our religion or where we were born or our sexual orientation, if we stand together, we can save this country. We can defeat oligarchy. We can defeat the movement toward authoritarianism. And in fact, we can create an economy and a government that works for all, not just the few. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
The senator from Indiana.
I am so glad the junior senator from Indiana occupies the